In a peaceful residential area, Margaret had a reputation for being overly involved in the affairs of her neighbors. With a commanding voice and an exaggerated sense of authority, she often took it upon herself to enforce unwritten community rules that only she seemed to recognize. Margaret viewed herself as the guardian of the neighborhood, though many saw her more as an intrusive busybody than a protector. One afternoon, she noticed a man she had never seen before unloading boxes from his car. This sight immediately unsettled her. The newcomer, Jason, was moving into a house down the street. To anyone else, he was simply a new neighbor. But to Margaret, his presence felt like a disruption. Jason was black, and in her narrow-minded view, his arrival meant the neighborhood was changing in ways she didn't approve of. Determined to send a message, Margaret decided to confront him. With feigned politeness masking her hostility, she marched toward Jason, her arms crossed tightly. "Are you sure you belong here?" she asked, her tone filled with condescension. Jason, momentarily caught off guard, responded calmly, "Yes, I just moved in." Margaret wasn't convinced. She glanced at his car, her mind racing with irrational assumptions. Her eyes locked onto his keys resting on the hood of the vehicle, and without thinking, she grabbed them. "If you're planning on staying, you better understand that we have standards here," she declared smugly, twirling the keys in her fingers. Jason took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "I'd appreciate it if you gave those back." But Margaret had other plans. She turned on her heel and walked away, satisfied with her stunt. In her mind, making Jason feel unwelcome was a victory. If he didn't have his keys, maybe he'd leave. Maybe he'd realize he wasn't wanted. Still clutching the keys, Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Putting on her most distressed voice, she reported an unfamiliar man causing trouble in the neighborhood. "Please, send someone quickly," she insisted, her voice trembling with false urgency. "He looks dangerous." Margaret had always believed the system would be on her side. She was certain that, with just a few carefully chosen words, she could frame Jason as a threat and have the police handle the rest. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights filled the street. Margaret's heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. She had expected this to go her way. She had envisioned Jason being questioned, perhaps even removed. But as the officers stepped out of their patrol cars, something happened that Margaret hadn't foreseen. Jason reached into his pocket and, with an air of quiet confidence, pulled out a badge. "Good afternoon, officers," he said, holding it up. "I'm Captain Jason Cole, and I live here." A heavy silence fell over the scene. The officers exchanged glances, processing what had just unfolded. The man they had been called to confront was not only innocent, he was law enforcement. Margaret's face drained of color. Her sense of control over the situation was slipping away rapidly. The lead officer turned to her, his expression stern. "Ma'am, is this the man you claimed was causing trouble?" Margaret stammered, grasping for an excuse. I didn't know who he was. He was acting suspicious." Jason remained composed. "Suspicious? All I did was move into my home, and she took my car keys." The officers listened carefully, their patience wearing thin. Margaret had wasted their time, manipulated the emergency system, and attempted to weaponize fear against an innocent man. One of the officers exhaled sharply before speaking. "Ma'am, you just made a false report. That's a serious offense." Margaret's stomach twisted. "I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe," she blurted. The officer shook his head. "Safe from what?" A man moving into his own home. For the first time, Margaret truly felt the weight of her actions. The superiority she had always carried was crumbling, replaced by panic. Jason, maintaining his dignity, addressed the officers. "I don't wish to press charges, but I do hope she understands what she's done." The officers nodded, acknowledging his restraint. Turning back to Margaret, they made it clear her behavior had consequences and the community would not tolerate such baseless accusations. As the realization sank in, Margaret shrank under the weight of the moment. What she had intended as an act of control had only exposed her prejudice, and now she would have to live with the shame of it. Meanwhile, Jason stood firm, a reminder that truth and integrity would always rise above fear and ignorance. And for the first time, The neighborhood began to see change, not in the way Margaret had feared, but in a way that truly mattered. As the evening air settled over the neighborhood, the once tense atmosphere began to dissipate. The flashing lights of the police cars faded as officers wrapped up their reports, exchanging firm nods with Jason before stepping back into their vehicles. Margaret stood motionless, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like an unbearable force. Her entire world had shifted in a matter of minutes. For years, she had walked these streets believing she was in control, believing she had a duty to protect the neighborhood from anyone she deemed unworthy. But now, with the eyes of her neighbors watching, she felt exposed, not as a guardian, but as a villain. Jason, still standing near his car, glanced at Margaret with an expression that wasn't filled with anger or gloating, just quiet disappointment. And somehow, that hurt her more than if he had lashed out at her. She had built her identity around the idea that she was righteous, but this moment shattered that illusion. One of the officers approached her one last time. "Consider yourself lucky," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Filing a false report, taking someone's property, that could have had serious consequences. If it weren't for Captain Cole's decision, you'd be facing charges right now." Margaret swallowed hard, unable to find the words to respond. She turned toward Jason, attempting to muster an apology, but the words felt empty in her throat. She had done more than just make a mistake. She had endangered someone's dignity, their safety, all because of her own deeply ingrained biases. Jason, ever composed, sighed and finally spoke. "You saw what you wanted to see," he said simply. "And because of that, you almost ruined an innocent man's day. Maybe worse." Margaret felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but deep down, she knew there was no defense. The other neighbors, many of whom had been silently watching the scene unfold from their porches and windows, now stepped forward cautiously. Some had long tolerated Margaret's intrusive behavior, shrugging it off as overzealousness. But this was something different. They looked at her with expressions that ranged from disappointment to outright disdain. Then, something unexpected happened. An elderly woman named Mrs. Reynolds, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, stepped forward. She had always been kind but firm, and now she looked at Margaret with knowing eyes. "Margaret," she said gently, "we all want to feel safe in our homes. But safety doesn't come from fear, it comes from understanding. You can't just decide who belongs here based on your own ideas of what's right." Margaret lowered her gaze, feeling the hot sting of shame rise in her chest. Jason took a deep breath before speaking again. "I moved here because I wanted a home, just like anyone else. I worked my whole life to serve my community. And yet, the first thing you saw when you looked at me wasn't a neighbor. It was a problem." He shook his head. "You don't have to like me, but you do have to accept that I belong here just as much as you do." A hush fell over the crowd. Margaret's heart pounded. For the first time in years, she felt small, not because of her status, but because she had let herself be ruled by prejudice rather than reason. The weight of Jason's words lingered in the air, heavier than anything Margaret had ever faced. The police officers finished their reports and drove off, leaving behind a street full of quiet reflection. Margaret turned slowly, making her way back to her house. As she reached her front door, she hesitated. The world felt different now. Her authority, once unquestioned, had crumbled. She had a choice to make: continue living in fear of change, or start listening, learning, and unlearning. Meanwhile, Jason, having finally moved into his home, took a deep breath and smiled to himself. He had faced worse in his life, but this was a victory, not just for himself, but for something bigger. For a moment, it felt as though the tide had turned, that perhaps this small confrontation had planted a seed of awareness in a place where it was desperately needed. And as the night deepened, the neighborhood remained still, carrying the echoes of a lesson learned. A reminder that the true strength of a community isn't in exclusion, but in its ability to grow, evolve, and embrace the truth.